What is so significant about the settings of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde?
Let's
Let's
find
find
out.
out.
How's it going, Revision Squad? It's DystopiaJunkie here with another Jekyll and Hyde revision video for you. And in this one, we are going to be analysing the various settings of Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, Jekyll and Hyde. However, I am thrilled to say that this is an analysis that I won't be doing on my own, because today I have been joined by Abby and Daniel from the Save Me From My Shelf podcast. Abby, Daniel, thank you both so much for joining me today. Would you mind sharing with the Revision Squad who you guys are and what you do?
Hi, I'm Dr. Abby Boucher,
I'm Dr. Daniel Jenkin-Smith.
and we are two English literature academics at Aston University. And as you've said, Liam, we run the Save Me From My Shelf podcast. That's a podcast that covers a lot of GCSE and A-level texts. And what we do is we recap it, we ridicule it, and we analyze it. And the whole goal is to sort of take, great literature off its pedestal to make you a little bit more comfortable with reading it and dealing with it.
Lovely. Thank you both so much. Honestly, I'm thrilled to have you both here with me today. I've been following the Save Me From My Shelf podcast for ages now, I think, and it's something that I've been recommending to all of my teacher friends because the blend of perceptive analysis and like genuinely witty banter that you guys offer is something that I think is just absolutely perfect for both teachers and students alike. Abby, remind me, where can people find the Save Me From My Shelf podcast?
We are on all major streaming platforms, so pretty much anywhere you can listen, you can find our show. We also have our YouTube channel where you can listen to it there. We're on Twitter at SMFMS_podcast, and we're on Instagram and TikTok at Save Me From My Shelf. So you can find us there. And we do take requests as well. So if you have something you're studying that you'd like us to cover, please drop us a line.
Awesome. Well then, folks, if you're watching this video, I would, of course, love it if you gave it a like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel too. But what I would really, really, really love is for you to hop over to Spotify, Apple Music, anywhere else you're going to find this podcast at, and follow, subscribe, whatever they call it on that service, to Save Me From My Shelf over there. All right then, so we promised viewers we'd be talking about the settings of Jekyll and Hyde in this video. Abby, Daniel, where do we start?
I think we have to start just with the general cityscape, don't we? There was a lot of writing in the Victorian era trying to suss out, what new urban cityscapes were like to the point that it becomes a character in and of itself. It's sort of a bit of a triplet if we're dealing with sort of the duality of Jekyll and Hyde here. The city becomes a sort of triplet in that.
Fog is a key aspect of Victorian cityscapes, isn't it? So, and I always like to say this about fog, that it can do two things at the same time, can't it? That it can, it obscures things, it makes it hard to see, but also it universalizes it because the fog touches everything, and because it finds its way into all parts of the city, no matter whether you're rich or poor. It becomes this kind of unifying force, and I think that sort of interesting duality between separation and universalization obviously speaks to the novel itself.
And also the issue of there's a lack of clear categorization. If there's one thing we know about the Victorians, they love to put things in very nice, neat boxes. They love to categorize things. But with something like fog, is it air or is it a liquid? It's sort of this in between liminal space, isn't it? And that's again a way to sort of tie that into the greater themes of the novel. There's also, it's something that you can get in the country and in the city, but in the city it takes on a slightly even more dangerous element because we have, all of the pea supers, the sort of polluted fog as well. So that imagery sort of filters through.
But it's a kind of product of modern industry and science as well, in that sense, in as much as it's like smog in the city. And I suppose you could kind of maybe parallel that with Jekyll's own experiments, although maybe that's pushing it a bit too far.
I think the idea there about the smog being sort of a product of its time comes across really clearly in the second quotation there at the bottom of the slide, about it being described as brown as umber. It creates certainly the impression that it's quite polluted and quite uncomfortable, quite choking or suffocating perhaps. I just picked out those other two quotations as well. A fog rolled over the city in the small hours, and the fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city. I think those three in general, if students are looking to discuss the fog in their essays, in their exams, in their classwork, I think those are three really key sort of central quotations that they could use that helps to really illustrates the sort of ideas that you both have already mentioned. The fact that it is quite mysterious, it does shut us off from each other, but it does also have that universalizing effect as well. It's something that affects everybody similarly, certainly in Stevenson's depiction of London.
Definitely. I mean, the fact that it's rolling and it's rolling over the city and drowning it, is that what you were saying, Abby, about whether it's ambiguity over whether it's liquid or gas or solid? And obviously sleeping is a kind of personified thing as well. It's a kind of presence, like a character, as you were saying about the city in general.
Well, and it's the fact that it's the sort of nature element as well. You get fog everywhere, not just in cities. And if we're getting really to the sort of nature of what things are and what is human nature and things like that. But here it's this sort of it's sort of been tainted by man. It's, the brown is
Perverted.
umber.
Yeah.
But I like that the fog still slept on the wing, so it is personified in that way where we're questioning what is humanity. We're giving these human characteristics to non-human things. So already these questions are popping up quite early on.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we've got to do then that the fog maybe challenges some of our perceptions and understanding of the city spaces, and also it's quite transgressive in a natural sense. It's not clearly sort of one state of matter or another. And I wonder if something else that comes across as being maybe a bit transgressive or certainly challenges boundaries in Stevenson's novel might be something that is known as the auditory imagination. I wonder if you guys could talk us through what we mean by this at all.
I think Stevenson invites us to perceive of the city in different ways. So fog is primarily a visual device, isn't it? But you have all of these kind of more aural senses of how the city kind of manifests itself, and they interact with other sensations in a kind of interesting ways. But I like this idea that there is the sound of the city kind of penetrating even into private spaces. So this first quote, "The procession of the town's life was still rolling in through the great arteries, the sound as of a mighty wind." That's when Utterson's in his little kind of his flat having his glass of wine. So even though you kind of have this private space, this kind of very upper middle class comforting cosseted world, you've still got the kind of sound of the city penetrating in. You can't fully escape it, and it kind of breaks down those barriers in an interesting way, I thought, but while also kind of reminding us that those barriers are there. It's one of those devices that can do both, like the fog.
I mean, we're going to talk about this a lot in terms of spaces, but again, like Victorians really love to classify things. You had your upper class spaces, you had your lower class spaces, you had your public, you had your private, and this is really breaking that down. And I think it's worth remembering that this is a Gothic novel. This is what we'd classify as the urban Gothic. So you have that sort of high Gothic trope of the fog. If you think about classic Gothic novels, it's a castle somewhere in the wilderness. You have the fog, you have the lightning storm, things like that. But we can see that sort of being porous and integrating itself here as well. And when it comes to Gothic novels, the one thing they really try to do is constantly undermine what is safe and known. They're always pushing at boundaries. So yeah, I love this idea of, where these Victorians were in the city, we have these very separate spaces, but sound can, it permeates everywhere. Things are a lot more porous than the Victorians would want to let on. And that's what this whole book is about, is breaking down those boundaries. But yeah, Daniel, as you said, are reinforcing that they're there in the first place, even if they're kind of ineffective.
Well, exactly, because it's a fragmentation of our power to perceive, isn't it? As well, that's what these sounds represent. That you can see a certain you have a certain visual way of perceiving the city, but there are these sounds that don't play along with that.
I wonder if this sort of the idea of like the things you do behind closed doors may actually still be heard, at large in the city. That's something that maybe ties into concerns around reputation that I think are really apparent in the novel as well, and is sort of really core perhaps to the Victorian upper class male sensibilities perhaps. So just the idea, that we've got this really distinctly Gothic setting, and like the idea of humans or people not being able to control what is secret and what is public, and just constantly being surrounded by noise as well is sort of quite eerie and quite unsettling, I thought. And it's something that I think is really central to our understanding of setting in the novella more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, the idea of reputation and what's overheard, because you get a lot of whispers about Jekyll. I mean, we don't see Dr. Jekyll until more than halfway through the novel, I don't think, but we hear about him constantly, and
Mm.
there are always these little pinpricks at his reputation. And in terms of hearing things and spaces, remember that the Victorian house had very separate spaces for where the owners of the house lived and then where the servants lived and worked. So, and there was, never the twain shall meet, really. But this idea that servants, especially at this period, they're a lot more literate. They have a lot more power than they used to have. Admittedly, still not very much. But there's an idea of the sort of growing that space in the divide filling up, where servants could hear things, they could tattle on you. So there, I think there's that question when Hyde is first sort of encountered, like, is he lower class? Is he a servant? How is he connected to this respectable man? Why is he going into these places that he should not be going?
So something we were talking about in preparation for this video was the idea that London might be acting as kind of like a metaphor for Edinburgh. How so? How is that the case?
Well, Edinburgh at this time was sort of notorious for having these incredibly stark social divides, but often right on top of each other. So, I mean, I lived in Edinburgh for a while, and it's a very three-dimensional city, and you can turn a corner and be in a really dodgy part of town, quite easily, or at least you could in the Victorian era. And so I think this stands in for those big class divides seen throughout all of Great Britain in the 19th century, made slightly more explicit here by sort of positing that London has them back to back, quite in the same way that Edinburgh did. So
Mm.
London didn't actually operate quite this much, but it's worth illustrating that you can try to sweep the lower classes under the rug and pretend that your beautiful middle class neighborhood, I'll never have to see a poor person in my life, but it's reinforcing that actually you can't really have these neighborhoods without each other.
I was thinking also that Edinburgh has the new town and the old town, doesn't it? The old town is kind of this medieval nightmare, and then the new town is this 18th century old kind of rational, nicely planned. And obviously that's a bit like Jekyll and Hyde, isn't it? The kind of reasonable scientist and the kind of depraved, creep. So I suppose there's a kind of historical aspect of that as well.
Yeah, I think a bunch of quotations from the first couple of chapters really help to illustrate that. So I just sort of popped a sort of run of quotations there at the bottom about how Jekyll's home is the pleasantest room in London. So again, we have sort of the well-to-do parts, while the back door of it is in a different street in a dingy neighbourhood. The door is blistered and disdained, and the building appears to bear the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. I think all of that kind of speaks to the idea that rather than having social classes be like physically and geographically quite distinct from each other, they're actually neighbors, and I guess literally neighbors in this sense. Like you can't get away from either the upper class or the lower classes. You can't get away from them whilst sort of operating in the other class's space. So I think that comes across really strongly in the novella and is something that we see in both Edinburgh and London of the time.
And the idea of the facade, I mean, literally the facade of his house, it's this, yeah, what is it, the pleasantest room in London. It faces out on an upper class street. And then even as you move through the house, we descend in class. So you go into what? The old dissecting room,
Mm.
which is sort of a much more professional space. It's less of a gentlemanly space. It's more of like, well, you have to work. And then even out through that back door, you end into you open into a properly seedy part of town. So there is this idea of like even within one hole, you can segue
Mm.
straight in. It's not even that they're neighbors; it's that this everyone has this within themselves to some extent.
Yeah, there are all these different microcosms and macrocosms.
Mhm.
Jekyll and Hyde are that on the individual level. Then you've got the house. Then you've got the city. Then you've got Great Britain divided between different nations or whatever. I'm not saying one of them is Hyde and one of them is Jekyll. But what would Wales be? But yeah, just quite a nice guy probably. But yeah, I think that there is that sense of a scale of similar themes operating all at once.
So what I've really liked about this discussion of Jekyll and Hyde's cityscapes at large is that it shows that the broad setting of Stevenson's novella, so his particular presentation of London, starts to bring about some key ideas like the transgression or blurring of boundaries, or even the sense of mystery that really pervades the story. But I was wondering, Abby and Daniel, are there any specific settings that we might choose to zoom in on in our analysis of the story?
Well, I think we've got to start with the famous back door, don't we? The house with two entrances. If we're looking at, I mean, the more interesting of the two is the back door rather than the front, which we almost never see. Yeah, so with the front and back door imagery, I mean, there's obviously a duality there. There's sort of, obviously two different ways to go into the house. But again, it's highly classified in terms of Victorian society. If you were a tradesman, if you were a servant, you would only enter a house through the back door, through a side entrance or something. You would not ever go in the front. So we already have that reading there, the sort of the classed space of the city. And this is given a sort of additional registers when they talk about it being the old dissecting room. So then again, we have this sort of blurring of lines like, oh, shouldn't that be a servant entrance? Oh no, it might be a step up. It's a little bit more professional than that because, it used to be an old, anatomy room, basically, for a doctor. So we can see how things are sort of breaking down just in how this space has sort of been used over the years.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, there's something, like I say about everything, but there's something paradoxical about the two entrances, isn't there? Or the back door and the front door, in as much as you have that dualism of back and front, but having both stresses their continuity, doesn't it? I mean, the house isn't just one corridor or something, but nevertheless, there is this kind of space that links them both, and even if it's obscured. So, again, a bit like the fog or something, you have at once separation and convergence operating all at once, if you know what I mean. And I think the novel plays with those sorts of motifs everywhere. So I'm just going to keep on hammering on about those because they are just all through the text, aren't they? Things seem separate, actually they're together, but they're still sort of separate.
And yet, despite that, the connection between the two sort of entrances is unsuspected. I mean, I don't know about you guys when you were reading this, but the first time I was reading it or rereading it recently, I still trip over the fact that the back door initially, although I as a reader know it's also connected to Jekyll's house, there seems to be a big sense of disconnect. And I think the quotation here at the bottom from Miss Enfield's dialogue, his embarrassment that he wasn't able to realise that the entrance to the lab was also the back way to Dr. Jekyll's, I think that's something that I really resonated with as the reader, I guess. Like, oh, blimey, okay, it's not just me who can't quite piece this together. There's a lot of a lot that isn't said around these spaces. Like Utterson ostensibly should be pretty familiar with the space, and he doesn't piece it together, or at least acknowledge it until a few chapters later. So we have sort of the romp around town with Enfield, and then we have him going to see Jekyll, going to Jekyll's house. But it's not until a little later than that the fact that these two doors, or these two doors sort of connects to the same building or general building space is established. And I think that's really disconcerting, a bit mysterious maybe.
This is another example of the Gothic. You have this safe thing, it's, your best friend's house. You've been there a million times. Of course you know it. And then to find this out, that's a really chilling moment. And it is disorienting. It's deliberately meant to disorient you because, as I said, London didn't quite operate on this. I think somebody mapped out where Jekyll's house was supposed to be, and they're like, no, it did not abut this sort of ridiculously dangerous slum or whatever. That's not what actually happened. But yeah, you're supposed to feel a little uncomfortable when you read it and have it not quite make sense. That's the whole point.
Well, Abby, I know you're desperate to get into this.
Desperate.
Tell us about the homoerotic reading of the doors then.
Yeah, so this is not my reading. This is something that loads of people have picked up on over the years. But the fact that Hyde only ever goes in through the back door, that's a big wink wink. That's not me just being filthy. That is actually, a sort of critical reading of this. The fact that and again, we'll talk about this later, there are no women in this book. We see one woman very briefly. This is chock-a-block full of dudes. And there are these from page one, these very homoerotic relationship. So you have Utterson and Enfield. Dr. Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll have a weird tension, almost like they were exes. They had this big falling out years ago, and and they're quite. Um, Dr. Lanyon's quite catty about Dr. Jekyll. He's a little, it feels like there's something more there. So yeah, the back door does operate as that sort of seedy space in other, sort of readings. It's not just class based. It's is something else going on.
So, if we've got the idea that the door itself could be seen as a symbol, metaphor, nod to sort of homosexual intercourse, perhaps, we have Jekyll in the window as adding to our homoerotic reading. I'm sure Abby or Daniel, you've got plenty to say on that, but I just sort of was thinking about this just earlier today. This really reminds me of the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. The kind of the idea of, yeah, if we're sort of seeing Utterson as this uh, kind of lover figure almost for Jekyll. He's looking up at his the desire of his affections or whatever, and he's looking up and is requesting that he comes out to play. Yeah, so it just really made me think of that scene actually. I'm sure not an intentional sort of reference or allusion at all, but there's something in that kind of romantic yearning perhaps of and like using space and setting to kind of depict that as well. But why else could Jekyll in the window add to our homoerotic reading of space in the story?
Well, I really like that as sort of a dark balcony scene, a sort of dark version of that, especially because let's not forget that Utterson has his new boyfriend with him. He's walking around with Enfield and he sort of awkwardly introduces them. So it is this breaking down of this, this sweet, pure love between, a young man and a young woman. And here it's like this, yeah, there are three people there and it's very awkward. And but the fact as well that Jekyll, he has to pop back in quite quickly because he's like, oh no, something's gone terribly wrong. I gotta go away. Yeah, and so I mean, windows and doors. That's a great image to focus on because it's a natural barrier. You can talk about how they easily separate things out. They also let people in, so it is sort of again that sort of porous boundary that we've been talking about. But it's that idea that he's at the window. He says he has to go. He shuts the window, and they sort of see him through the window. So again, you can sort of see he's trying to shut them out, but you can see a little bit what's happening.
That's again speaks to that the sort of the role of different senses in the text, doesn't it? The kind of the visuality of the window, and you have that. It's a channel for communication, but once that gets closed, you can just get a kind of brief glimpse of what's going on. But even then, that's kind of framed and manipulated in certain ways. So it's about the presentation of self, I suppose.
We have other scenes that we'll talk about later where you sort of see things through the window and you have to infer what's happening. Weirdly, it's one of the few times where the auditory is cut off. You can't actually hear what's happening, but you can see it. It's or sort of an inverse of that, rather than I can just hear something but I can't see it. Here you can just see but not hear, and you have to try to piece together all of these different senses to sort of get to the truth of what's happening.
Yeah, and I think if I was just to add kind of a third setting or location related to Hyde's door, Jekyll's back door, the cabinet. I was thinking about the cabinet again in preparation for us meeting today, and I sort of thought, obviously, there's a lot of fun around Hyde's name, right? Hyde, hiding, whatever. And I was thinking, well, hang on, he's not quite hiding in the closet, but he's certainly hiding in the cabinet. The sort of at the end of the narrative or towards the end of the narrative. Now, of course, like the phrase "coming out of the closet" is a fairly modern colloquialism, but the idea of gay men hiding themselves, either literally or figuratively, has been quite present in literature for ages. So, again, Jekyll hiding in the cabinet, is there something there? Does that add to our homoerotic reading, perhaps, of setting in the novella? I'm not too sure, but it's just something that I think it's just a fun little pun that I wanted to make, to be honest.
It's all about that, though, isn't it? It's all about inferences and intimations and what's going on? What's that guy doing behind closed doors? I think the crux of the novel is about suspicions and hidden selves and disguising who you really are. And so in that sense, it's always about these kind of potentially transgressive identities or practices or whatever you want to call it.
So actually, our discussion of the doors, I think, has been really illuminating because it shows how quite a central setting, I think, to the text does allow us to use that as a platform to talk about some of these really central themes. So mystery, we've got class, we've got reputation and reputability, we've got sort of the queer reading that it really sort of makes possible, I think, and really builds and develops. So I think what we've done here is shown that although, yes, we've got a set of two doors, like at face value, two doors, actually we can do so much with that. I think students sort of watching this video as they're sort of studying or revising Jekyll and Hyde, I hope that you've managed to see that these two doors are so much more than two doors, and you can do so much with them in terms of your own analysis and your own sort of interpretation. But just earlier, Abby, you mentioned another setting that we might see in a bit more detail, and I believe you're talking about the Maid's Garret, I think it is.
I am, yes.
So what can we say about the Maid's Garret?
Well, this is one of the few times where we actually see into a lower class space and sort of roughly through the eyes of a lower class person. And it's the only time a woman is seen at all in the entire text. I'm not sure if the maid actually has any lines. They might just sort of recap roughly what she told the police. But this is that's such a wonderful porous bit of she's in this wealthy person's house, so we have a class bit there, but she's tucked away, in her lower class bit of this, upper class house, but she's also able to look out on the street, which then opens it up to a whole thing. It's nighttime, it's a lot seedier, it's even lower class, and this is the scene where we witness Mr. Hyde kills Sir Danvers Carew, and this is another scene in which there's a strong queer reading inference here. I don't know that I totally buy this one myself, but there are plenty of critics that have expressed that Sir Danvers Carew, he walks up to Hyde on the street, he says something, Hyde, sort of goes mad and, beats him to death. He comes in with the folding chair or whatever. It's quite a grisly death. There are some critics that read that as Sir Danvers, this, very respectable, nobleman, propositioning Hyde for sex. I don't think that the evidence is fully there as far as I'm concerned, but there's certainly a sort of, well, why are you, a rich upper class guy, out late at night on the street talking to this seedy looking guy? Like, what did you want from him?
Yeah, no smoke without fire.
No smoke without fire. But it's really interesting seeing this through the maid's eyes, because she can't hear what's going on. She can only see. And so she's sort of putting her stamp on what she thinks is happening based on how these people look. So she's guessing, because Sir Danvers looks rich, that he's kindly and he's nice and he was probably just asking for directions. And she's sort of making all these assumptions about what their character is like and what they're saying. And she has no idea. We never find out. It'd be interesting. I wish we had Hyde's diary to tell us exactly what happened in this scene, but we don't.
I think that the scene really underscores that point as well. I've put a few quotations on the slides, but like there's a page and a half I could have copied over. And something that I sort of noticed throughout the sort of the maid's kind of narrative, or the paraphrasing of her narrative, the word like seen comes across or like appeared. So those words to me keep on suggesting like she's kind of half guessing, like she's making assumptions. She's not actually entirely sure what's going on. And then sort of moving on to after Hyde kills Carew, it's then the maid faints. So she, firstly, maybe you can question, okay, so to what extent does she really remember what's happened here? If she's blacked out afterwards. But then also she has clearly seen something happen, faints, wakes up sometime afterwards. So she sees like the terrible event occur, but she doesn't actually see perhaps the more useful thing of where Hyde then went. So we've got like this, not just being restricted in terms of senses that we're able to call upon here, but even the senses that we can call upon. So her sight here is maybe a bit patchy. She doesn't see certain things, and she may not actually see what she thinks she sees as well. It's all very, again, I guess we're going to be repeating quite a few things in our chat here, but it just really drums up that sense of mystery. Do we really know what happened? Does the maid really know what happened? To what extent is that sort of a genuine, credible retelling of this story?
And it reinforces how much of Victorian society operated on how things appear, how things seem. If you have money, you have somebody who could just sort of look at you and say, "You have money. Oh, you seem really nice. Oh, why is this horrible, ugly man doing?" Just making all of these assumptions on a facade.
Utterson is obviously like a kind of audience proxy, isn't he? We're in his head and we follow him around and try and piece together the mystery with him. But she's kind of a little bit of a sort of audience or Utterson proxy, maybe as well, maybe another remove. And we have a bit of sort of free and direct style, don't we, about her kind of. We have like her sort of testimony kind of relayed back to us, but also about her temperament, saying that she's of a kind of romantic disposition and stuff. So we kind of enter into her head and see what she sees and what only what she can see, like you were saying, Liam. Like we don't know anything more than she knows, but also we are kind of held at arm's length from her. So you might say that there's a kind of just a purely narrative function there, that is a kind of mystery, having this, we have a testimonial to this crime, but we don't have the full info, and that heightens a sense of mystery. I suppose there's also like the kind of class and gender stuff as well, that this we like to operate in Utterson's head, this kind of upper middle class respectable guy, but there is this kind of other side to the self that we're prepared to engage with, but we will hold at arm's length. So I think there's something a bit like that going on there.
So the maid's Garret does maybe have some sociogeographic kind of readings as well, or ideas that relate to it there. Is there anything we can sort of say, in addition to obviously the maid and sight and perception, anything more about class that we can maybe talk about in relation to that setting?
Just in that, much like we talked about the two doors, sort of seeming like they were these completely disconnected spaces, but actually, as you go through the house, there is that sort of segueing. Here's another chance where we see a sort of a point of porousness or liminality. It's a sort of segue, as I said, from the upper class space to a sort of lower class space that's still respectable, to then looking out on the lower class space that's not respectable. So it's a good point where you can see even in one whole, nothing is ever sort of purely just one class, just one whatever. As much as the Victorians would have loved to have classified it like that.
Yeah. But I think sociogeography, I suppose this is something that people say, isn't it? But it's not really a sort of critical term that it's not like made it into the OED, has it? But I was thinking, because psychogeography is the one that is more often used, where you kind of, it's about thinking about how spaces impress certain like ideas or themes on the mind of the walker, or the just the person occupying that space. Everybody has that, don't they, where you kind of you associate a particular road with a particular feeling or something, maybe something that happened to you there before. But the social is an extension of that, isn't there? Isn't it? And it's kind of like what we've been saying already, but I think this scene really impresses what the nature of that sort of social geographical kind of conflation is, that there are these particular social connotations for particular spaces, and that on those thresholds there are kind of rules for how they interact, these kind of different social geographical spaces, and how much they can see of each other. Like, I mean, that almost kind of sums up what we've already been saying about Danvers Carew and the maid, doesn't it? That the maid has some access to this upper class world, but only in a kind of transgressive form. Why is Danvers Carew out at this time of night in this dodgy neighborhood? And also, she can only get a partial impression of what's going on. She can only just see him from afar. She doesn't have access to what he's saying. She can't really feel the bumps on his head unless she has some very long calipers. So there is that kind of sense of certain rules and certain kind of built-in obstructions that prevent classes from engaging, but also they can't fully be separated. And I think that kind of runs through the text, doesn't it? That sort of the symbolic, social, spatial mix.
Yeah, the idea of, look how close we are together, but also how far apart. I mean,
Yeah.
as you're saying, Daniel, yeah, she is witnessing this, quite close up, and yet she's still miles different. She's not actually fully present for it.
So, although the maid's Garret is ostensibly quite a minor setting, it appears in one chapter in the novella, and a fairly short chapter at that. I think once again we've seen how analysing it has brought up those super central ideas to the text. Again, ideas around sort of transgressiveness and sort of boundaries blurring, whether those are social boundaries or sort of sexual boundaries. We've got the idea that we can't always necessarily rely upon our senses, even when some senses are sort of shut off. The ones that remain in place can't necessarily be trusted. And that again really emphasizes a sense of mystery and uncertainty and sort of terror, I guess, that kind of comes across throughout the novel. So once again, the Maid's Garret, although seemingly quite a minor setting, is one that I think students studying Jekyll and Hyde really ought to pay attention to for the reasons that we've just outlined. But what might our final setting be if we're going to be talking about a third and final setting in depth, I wonder?
So Daniel and I got into a big fight on our episode of the podcast where we cover this text about the cheval glass in Jekyll's lab. Daniel, have you changed your stance on this? Do you want to run us through what the
I'll
debate was?
Sorry. Right. So there's a bit where they're investigating the place. They see all the creepy books that have been sort of profaned and stuff, and then they dwell for a very long time on the big mirror. And I was like, why would you, of all things, why would you dwell on a big mirror? And Abby was saying that, that kind of mirror is associated with a sort of, a dressing room or whatever, like a kind of upper middle class boudoir or something where you kind of get dressed and, you look all, nice. It's like a sort of, a private thing, not something you'd associate with a laboratory. And so that's, again, this idea of transgression. I think you're obviously right. That's true. But I think I was just thinking about it. Imagine this, like you walk into somebody's bedroom and you find their dead body. And then you're not going to be like, oh, why is there a washing machine in there? Are you? You're going to be like, oh my God, there's a dead body on the floor. You're not going to be like, oh, what's that over there? I think it's a question. It's not a question of you're right, but it's not a question of like, it's more about where it is in the story. Like you've just broken into this room. There's a dead guy there. Oh my God, why has he got a mirror? Now that's really creepy. So I stick by my point.
The issue is, again, we're looking at this from a very modern perspective. Again, the Victorians like to divide and compartmentalize, so you would only have certain objects in certain rooms. This would be as extreme as, okay, so yes, you break down a door, there's a dead body there, there's all this profane books, and in the middle of the room, inexplicably, a toilet? You go,
that's why I fell in love with the place. No, no, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. You'd be focusing on a dead body.
No,
you are right. You are right. I think but it's more like when the police go in. It's like when the police would go in afterwards to investigate. They'd be like, toilet. That's weird. But when you're in the moment.
They've given time to the dead body and the profane books. Let him have a moment with the mirror. Okay, I'm sorry. Right. I read that he had a cheval glass in there, and I was like, this guy's freak levels are off the charts. Exactly. That's what I did when I read it.
That's fine, then. That's fine. We just have to agree to disagree. But I mean, I agree with you, but also I think you're wrong. But also, I agree with you. No, I don't think you're wrong. I agree with you, but I also think I'm right. It's the dualism, isn't it? It's weird to have a cheval glass in the bedroom. I mean, in the laboratory, but you also wouldn't focus on it. Like, it's the argument is a microcosm for the themes dealt with by the book.
Okay, but right. So whether or not you would immediately notice it or not, the fact is the mirror is there, and it's something that they do spend quite a bit of time talking about. So let's talk about it.
Yes.
And I actually, in terms of like sort of student essays and arguments and things, I love stuff like this. If you pick one tiny, like smaller than you could think possible detail, you can spin easily a whole essay out of this. I could write an essay on this right now, just sort of spitballing on how they use the mirror without even adding in any research. At a very surface level, a mirror reflects two things, it shows a double. But also they talk about the mirror as having its own space. So it's not even that it just reflects things, but they sort of talk about it as like, you could almost go into it And there's also the idea they talk about the mirror as a witness, like what has this mirror seen and reflected? So this idea that this inanimate object could even have memory, much like with the fog, they're sort of personifying certain things. We're in that weird space of what does it even mean to be human? I mean, that's all of what Jekyll and Hyde is about. Is like what is humanity? Has Jekyll lost his humanity? What is Hyde? Is he an animal? Is he But we're sort of giving humanity to inanimate objects as well. So it's these little moments that sort of help to break down these rigid classifications.
The text is so much about the imaginary, isn't it, and about the things that we sort of project onto the unknown. And we might speculate one thing, and then turns out it's something way weirder. I mean, but in this case, it's almost the opposite, isn't it? Like you say, on the surface level of the mirror, it doubles things, but I mean, in a literal sense, a mirror is just the surface level, isn't it? There is no depth to a mirror. But the fact that they would project a sense of depth onto it, or the fact that they would imagine that a mirror was a kind of eye of its own, on that, it has that sort of metaphorical level in itself. But on top of that, even though they've now had the sort of, they're about to reach the truth of the situation, they're still projecting these kind of fantasies onto the world around them. They still see the mirror as somehow, more than it is.
And then practically, what is the mirror doing there? Right? This is something that ostensibly should belong only in a bedroom. It would be incredibly weird to have this in a sort of like chemistry lab, especially at this period. So it's them sort of piecing together that Jekyll is clearly concerned with the physical transformation, either one way or the other. I mean, I'm sure when he transforms back into Jekyll, he wants to make sure that that facade is fully intact. And we talk a lot about how he notices Hyde changing as he takes over. Hyde gets taller and taller the more and more of Jekyll he sort of takes away. So there is very much this sort of that idea of physiognomy, that the physical can actually represent what's going on with you internally, with your intellect and your morality and things like that.
So there's a quote in Dr. Jekyll's account of everything, basically, that I think ties into why, at least from his rationale, why he's got the cheval glass there. And it's there, the bottom quote there, taken from chapter 10, where he says he was using it to assess if his identity is still there, his identity as Dr. Jekyll, rather than Mr. Hyde fully taking over. So at that sort of reading, there is maybe validity in the cheval glass as an image referencing the duality of man. There's sort of these two sides to Jekyll and Hyde that students, of course, are very familiar with. I wonder, though, sort of linking back into why is it there? Why is it so shocking that it's there? So I wasn't aware that cheval glasses were more commonly associated. You sort of said like with women's dressing rooms is sort of accurate, right? Does this maybe that queering of gender? Is that why it's so fixated upon the idea that it's something that is so out of type for Dr. Jekyll as this very reputable, well-to-do Victorian upper-class male, that it's confirming a sort of suspicion maybe that Utterson and Poole were already having, there's something a bit odd, there's something unspoken about Jekyll here, and then they see something that really transgresses those gender boundaries. I wonder.
I mean, cheval glass is something that men would have had too, but it definitely is associated a lot more with with women. It's much more of a dressing sort of thing, and whenever we get into that sort of rhetoric, we tend to focus on then women and beauty standards and things. But you're absolutely right that that's again a little wink at a queer reading of why does he have this slightly feminized item of furniture moved into this incredibly male professional space. We did not have a ton of women who were professionally or even sort of hobbyist like chemists to this level. That would be seen as a very male space, especially because it used to be a professional dissecting room as well. So yeah, just I think that is what it's the blurring of the sort of the hobbyist and the professional, male and woman spheres, the domestic spheres as well. So I think it's a weird item to sort of link a bunch of these threads together.
So Jekyll's laboratory, of course, is a space of science. It's a space that is uh, maybe disturbed or disrupted by the presence of the cheval glass. But also, we've got the idea of the knocking on the door, these strange voices that seem to be super connected to the lab as well. Abby and Daniel, do you have any sort of thing you want to share or sort of raise about those ideas?
Well, Daniel, I remember you on the podcast talking a lot about hearing the strange voices coming through the door, and it's something that Poole, the butler, he can't quite place, where he's saying, I don't know if that's my
Mm.
master's voice or not," and how what a scary moment that is.
Yeah, I suppose again we've had that idea of the auditory imagination, or the in terms of the city at large, that you have a kind of immediate visual sense of the space, but then there are these sounds that oppress you. You saying, I don't know if that's my master's voice. I'm thinking about the little dog looking in the phonograph, which is kind of, it's from this period, isn't it? A dog that's fooled into thinking that a recording of his master's voice is his master. That's the implication of that image. Here we have the opposite. His master, the butler's master, is actually talking through the door, but he has a different voice, and so the guy's like, I don't know who it is. So yeah, we have this sense of again, just the evidence is continuously confounding, confounding what is within the realms of the believable.
And can we trust our senses? Can we trust
Mm.
the assumptions we're making based on those senses? So I think that's really all it is. It's just constantly breaking down people into sort of different little body parts or different senses. I can see but I can't hear. I can hear but I can't
Mm.
see. And what truth can we get from that? And this was also the period, let's not forget, when psychology got going. So, you were talking earlier about psychogeography, and when you walk through a space, you have certain associations with it. Like, oh, I remember when I was here last, this happened, or oh, my mother always said never go here
Yeah.
because, and you have these associations, or even just, as you walk down the street and there's a fork in the road, which path do you take and why? And so they got really into ideas of the self at this period, and ideas of even the split self. So what we would now sort of
Mm.
call, like split personality. I think it's called something else now. But this is a very psychological book. That's why the big, reveal at the end, it happens in a clinical space. It happens in a lab, which I know is not quite the same thing as a psychologist's office or something, but it is a sort of medical phenomena, and you have all these different elements of the self that are sort of coming piecemeal, and they're only giving partial truths to a whole person. So I
Mm.
think that's worth looking at as well.
So we've just then, I guess, really analysed Jekyll's lab in quite a bit of detail. And once again, just a comment more to viewers than within our discussion. I think what we've seen there is that the lab, which is probably quite a prominent setting within the story, is once again evoking those ideas of mystery around fragmentation, around transgressiveness, around those boundaries that repeatedly challenged in Stevenson's text. And I think that's, again, if you're writing about any of those key themes, the duality of man, mystery, class, boundaries at large, maybe this is a setting that you're going to want to talk about in quite some detail. As Abby alluded to earlier, you could focus on just the Cheval glass and certainly go on a sort of really lovely, beautiful, analytically rich essay that I think could lead to some very perceptive insights that should, if we're sort of going down the exam route here, should get you some very high marks because it's going to show some very sort of insightful analysis, which is exactly the sort of thing that I think you're after. However, Abby, Daniel, we've covered the cityscapes of Jekyll and Hyde in quite some detail, and now three settings as well. But I was wondering, overall, what could we say about the settings of Jekyll and Hyde? What is their overall significance? I'm going to pass this conclusion over to you guys.
Well, for me, the setting itself almost operates. It's so prominent. It almost operates as another character, or as a clue to solving the mystery in the first place. It's all laid out right in the landscape for you, if you're willing to sort of piece it together. Yeah, Daniel, do you want to take?
But I suppose it can never be fully pieced together. You
Yes.
have to kind of construct a model of the city or of the particular locations, and indeed of the self. You have to kind of construct that as you read, just as much as Utterson is doing that. And you know no matter what you do, you're always going to have a few pieces left over, or you have a few pieces too short, or whatever. There's a kind of it's a text that, I mean, maybe this is kind of undermined by the ultimate confession, but nonetheless, it's a text that seems to kind of play on ideas of a lack of resolution or a lack of completion, but also which pushes always toward coherence. And yeah, like we say here, these kind of ideas of thresholds and of fragmentation and estrangement of these are all ways that Stevenson constructs a sense of space as having this kind of diverse symbolic power in the world of the novel that obviously reflects very closely how the plot works, but also like you were saying, Liam, how the actual narrative is constructed. I love that when you have all those different registers all kind of working together. Maybe that's against the spirit of the novel. Maybe they shouldn't be working together. I don't know. I was going to say the other thing though, that it goes both ways. This thing does. So space has a symbolic function in the novella, doesn't it? It has this psychogeographical role in the world of the text, but it goes the other way, that non-spatial things are spatialized, aren't they, throughout the text. So that's an important thing to remember, that these things are always a two-way street, these symbolic relationships. Jekyll's always talking about the fortress of the self was being attacked, and there's always these kind of, I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but there are these senses of like selfhood, or feelings, or the investigation itself having a kind of physical spatiality, which is obviously can only be metaphorical. But yeah, so I think that's important to remember too, that it kind of, like a mirror, it flips both ways.
And it implies boundaries. If you're talking about the fortress of the self, well, his self is nothing but permeable.
Yeah.
So,
There's an irony there. Yeah. It's not a very good fortress, maybe.
So then, with those last points very persuasively put, I guess that is where we should bring our analysis of Jekyll and Hyde's settings to a close. Before ending this video then, I'd like to give a quick couple of thanks. Of course, massive thank you to Abby and Daniel. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute delight, and I really enjoy working with you guys, as we have done on the podcast as well. I hope.
thank you for having me.
Well, honestly, I know I said to you guys before, I've been meaning to get in touch with you for ages about doing a collaboration. So it worked out very nicely that we were both sort of looking to work with each other. It just the stars aligned, or the fog lifted. I don't know, to reveal the stars. So yeah, hopefully, audience, you've considered this to be a really super rich discussion, and that you found it super useful. Abby, Daniel, remind me, where exactly can people find you when they want to hear even more of your brilliant analysis, plus some comedy gold as well?
So our podcast, Save Me From My Shelf, can be found on any streaming service for podcasts and on YouTube. We do cover a lot of A-level and GCSE texts already in our back catalog. So we have, An Inspector Calls and Twelfth Night and A Christmas Carol, Pride and Prejudice, 1984, a lot of the classics. So yeah, please get in contact with us, either at our email at savemefrommyshelf@gmail.com if you want to make a request, or on Twitter at smfms_podcast, and we're also on Instagram and TikTok.
The TikToks as well are particularly. I always find them funny with the bad Goodreads sort of segments. It just tickles me, the stuff that people say about these canonical texts, and clearly misreading them or venting their frustration. As I'm sure, if you're studying them for your GCSE or A levels, you've probably got quite a bit to say about these texts that you are forced to read. I should say as well, as I alluded to sort of a moment ago, Abby and Daniel very graciously invited me onto Save Me From My Shelf recently. So following their analysis of Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower, they had me on to take part in a roundtable discussion of sorts about all things dystopia and post-apocalypse. So if you'd like to hear us chat about maybe one of my specific areas of expertise, please do check out that episode. It will be up by the time that this is up, I believe, and I'll make sure to put a link out to that episode in particular, but also to the podcast at large in both the video description, which you can see YouTube at the moment down there, or I'll make a pinned comment as well to have those links in there too. Secondly, if I'm doing some thanks, just thanks to you, the viewer. I'm sure Abby and Daniel would agree with me when I say that the reason why we do the things that we do on YouTube or in podcasts is because we want to help you out with your studies. And I think I'm sure, again, Abby and Dan would agree, the engagement that we've seen in both podcasts and here on YouTube is what brought us onto each other's radars and has helped us sort of come together to have what I found to be some really delightful conversations and chats and whatnot. So yeah, thank you so much. As ever, I like to wrap up this video by expressing that I hope that you, the viewer, if you want to join me in pointing, Abby and Daniel, please do, that you, the viewer, I hope you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are studying or revising, please remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. Cheers.